Right, in this video, I'm going to continue on with our class lectures, talking today about Bell's racial realism. So far we've looked at one case from history, Yickwo versus Hopkins, in which the relationship between race and the law is made more or less explicit. Today we'll look at some analysis of American jurisprudence from the perspective of critical race theory. Before I begin diving into the specifics of Bell's piece, I think it would be helpful for us to think about what other people have said by way of characterizing critical race theory. So, from an older book that you can access online from Delgado and Stefanik, here are 5 tenets of critical race theory. And ask yourself while I'm reading these things, how controversial exactly are these tenets of critical race theory? So the first tenet is that racism is ordinary, and because it's ordinary, it's difficult to eradicate. The second tenet is that one of the reasons that racism is difficult to eradicate is that it serves important material and psychic interests of an oppressive racial majority. The third is that race is a social construct, which means there's something mind-dependent about the category of race. It isn't a biological kind. It isn't something you could find out in the world. In other words, in some way, the existence of our racial categories depends on one's mind. Fourth, a society's need might change over time. And as those societal needs change, so too will their treatments of various races. And then lastly, those in a subservient social class are in a superior evidential position to report about the prevalence of racism. So let's think about each of these 5 tenets in turn very briefly, just so that we can think about the way particular proponents of critical race theory might agree with or disagree with, or say things that issue from these 5 tenets. So the first tenet is that racism is ordinary. Now, as I think about this tenet, it seems incredibly uncontroversial to me because, after all, many different things are ordinary, and some might be maybe even more ordinary than others. I haven't thought about that extensively, but it seems like a felicitous thing to say, doesn't it? Some things might be more ordinary than others. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. Well, let's think about some of the things that are ordinary. A car accident might be ordinary, though perhaps you've never been in one. A rainy day might be ordinary, even though it's not raining right now. But it seems to me that if you were to plot out the number of rainy days in a year and the number of car accidents, you'd find vast variety, wide-ranging frequencies with which these things would happen, wouldn't you? Out of a year, you might get, say, 100 rainy days, but out of a year, you might not get any car accidents whatsoever. And yet, in some sense, it makes sense to talk about both of these things as being ordinary. And so when one says that racism is ordinary, this isn't the claim that it's especially frequent or that it happens every once in a while. In fact, it's so vague, really, that one is free to kind of supply their own conception of the ordinary. But just think of all the other things that are ordinary, and then ask yourself whether manifestations of racist conduct are sufficiently like those other things that you held to be ordinary. And I suspect that even under conceptions of ordinariness that opponents of critical race theory might hold, even under their own conceptions of ordinariness, there probably is some frequency with which racism manifests that would render a statement like one true. And so I think that at the end of the day, when you compare all the ways in which things are held to be ordinary, a statement like one might be fairly uncontroversial, which is to say that even the most staunch opponent of critical race theory might say, okay, under that conception, under that standard of ordinariness, sure, racism is ordinary. Now, the second tenet of critical race theory is this idea that racism is difficult to eradicate because racists are benefiting from it. It seems to me uncontroversial as well, because it doesn't say that racism can't be eradicated completely. That would be a stronger thesis. What this tenet does say is that racism is difficult to eradicate, makes it harder. I think again of a parallel argument. Imagine a doctor who, during COVID, would recommend the COVID vaccine, and then imagine further that they receive some kind of compensation for doing so. Now, you might think one of the reasons why it would be hard for the doctor not to recommend the vaccine is that they get some money from doing so, right? So they receive a financial benefit from recommending the vaccine. That wouldn't follow from that. This is the only reason figuring into the doctor's deliberation about whether to administer the vaccine. It wouldn't follow that there might be some doctors who wouldn't in good conscience recommend the vaccine. It wouldn't follow that it's an altogether sensible thing to do, that just because they receive some money from doing so, that they ought to recommend the vaccine. But you can see that it's a reason to be weighed in their decision. Now, of course, financial compensation will be some kind of reason in that context. Now, in much the same way, I think that these considerations about race, an oppressive dominant race receiving some psychic and material benefits from racism, they do provide some reason against eradicating racism for the dominant class. And so it seems relatively uncontroversial that that premise two would have some kind of explanatory power. One of the reasons why it might be difficult to eradicate racism is that people are benefiting from it in various ways. And the interesting thought here is that even in attempts to eradicate racism, you still might benefit and profit from such things. And so the problem is really quite serious and quite far-reaching. And again, I don't see why this would be all that controversial. I mean, we're not saying that it's a dispositive reason or it's the only reason why racism sticks around, but we are saying it is one reason, it seems. And so, again, I can't really see, if I was an opponent of critical race theory, what would be so controversial about the second tenet. In contrast, I do think that there is something fairly controversial about tenet three. Now, tenet three is the idea that race is a social construct. It doesn't correspond to any sort of biological reality, any biological properties, or anything like that. Now, I hold this to be controversial, as do the authors of this book, Delgado and Stefanik. And moreover, philosophers of race are divided on this issue. So some people, including one of the most prominent philosophers of race at the University of Pennsylvania, Keishon Spencer, hold that there is some kind of mind-independent reality to the category of race. Like, it doesn't depend on our minds in some way. I'll leave that for you to figure out on your own time. What proponents of critical race theory, such as Delgado and Stefanik, are often thought to hold about this is that you could actually deny this third tenet of critical race theory and still, in good conscience, call yourself a critical race theorist. So they do hold it to be one of the most controversial tenets, and they allow for some sort of disagreement with respect to tenet three. Tenet four, again, though, seems like it's relatively uncontroversial. It stands for the idea that a society's treatment of some race might change over time as the societal needs change. A lot of times, specifically in this text by Delgado and Stefanik, what one finds is reference to Japanese Americans, especially leading up to World War II. So one racial stereotype prevalent at the time was that Japanese Americans were very good workers. They were incredibly driven, diligent, hard workers. And then, as paranoia sort of rose at the time, Americans, out of a fear of Japanese attack, began to construe and portray Japanese Americans as inexorably loyal to the emperor, right? So all of their hard work and good virtues were thrown out the window in favor of a racial stereotype in which Japanese citizens were loyal to the emperor and would do whatever he said, even though they were American citizens in some cases or immigrant workers. And so that kind of stereotype would ultimately figure in a justification for the internment of Japanese Americans, right? And so it seems like as societal needs change, meaning the needs of a more dominant oppressive class, the treatment of a race might change. And that seems, again, to me to explain some facts from history quite well. So you might think about that as also being uncontroversial. Now, the fifth tenet is merely, I think, an extension of the first tenet. The fifth tenet is just that those who are in a subservient social class are in this better epistemic position, they have more evidence, to report on the prevalence of racism and its commonality. So we held earlier that racism under various conceptions of what it is to be ordinary might properly be considered ordinary. However, how would we learn about whether racism is ordinary? Tenet 5 is just the idea is that the usual targets of racism are in a better position to report on how much there is. And that seems right to me. It just seems like those who would be the usual targets of racism would have more evidence about how much racism there is in this country, and other cultures as well, I suppose. So again, nothing really from this list of tenets of critical race theory strikes me as especially controversial, even though really a lot of there's a lot of to-do about this in the media and whatnot. And we're often told that critical race theory is supposed to be very controversial and whatnot. I can see how tenet 3 is properly considered controversial. In fact, almost all theorists would agree with that, I think. At least that it's controversial, though they might have their own stand on the issue. And so at the end of the day, though, I just think that these 5 tenets of critical race theory aren't too bad. Even those opposed to critical race theory being taught in schools might not have so much to say about these 5 tenets upon reflection. Though maybe I'm just being overly optimistic about people, but I don't think anything I've said here is extremely controversial. In contrast, oftentimes particular claims made by those who are critical race theorists do tend to be controversial and meet with a lot of backlash, as we'll see in the lecture for today. So I think we should keep in mind these 5 tenets of critical race theory. But what I'd like to do now is move on to sort of think about Derrick Bell's contribution to the literature, how you should understand his piece, and how you might think of the relationship between the tenets of critical race theory and the things that particular proponents of critical race theory might say in its name. So to get us into the headspace of what I'd like to talk about today with respect to Derrick Bell, we should just think about legal reasoning as usual. We should think about an ordinary kind of legal reasoning that we've been doing in this class. Consider the simple argument I have on this slide. If the Constitution protects abortion, then a state must show a compelling interest in order to completely prohibit abortion. But the state has no such compelling interest, and so a state may not completely prohibit abortion. So far, so good. This is just run-of-the-mill legal reasoning, right? But there's a wrinkle that needs to be ironed out here. Where exactly are we getting these premises? So far in the class, I might have led you to believe that really all legal reasoning is concerned with is a certain relationship between premises and conclusions. But really, there's more to the picture that needs to be explained. And what needs to be explained is where in the world we're getting premises like 1 and 2. Where are we getting these? Did these just fall from the heavens to us? Well, a common enough thought, which I'll explicate in what follows, is just that these things, like any other task in life, are the result of value-based thought processes, which may or may not be affected by things like racial prejudices. And so let's look at 2 kind of conflicting opinions about the source of premises like this. Maybe they're not so much questions about the source of these, but they are opinions about the quality and the prospects for success. The first of these views is what I'll call legal formalism. Legal formalism was very, very popular at the beginning of the 20th century. It was thought in those days that the judge was kind of like a slot machine. What you'd do essentially is that you'd feed legal facts and legal rules into the slot machine, The judge would consider and weigh them, and very much like a calculator, would output a uniquely correct legal result. Think about Bridges versus Hawksworth. What it is for a judge to get the correct legal opinion is to apply logic and the rules and the facts of the case, shake it up, and then what comes out of the bag is a uniquely correct legal opinion. So the judge is essentially like a well-oiled machine. He's like a calculator, if you will. And so legal reasoning really is correct when you've applied the logic and the correct rule and whatnot to a case. And people were very impressed with this line of thought, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. However, upon considering questions about the source of these legal premises, you might say, well, of course, there is some kind of good-making feature of legal reasoning in which we can evaluate whether the rules were logically applied to a set of facts. Of course, there's always that standard. But there is some judgment exercised in deriving these premises. Where exactly did these premises come from? Why was one premise chosen instead of another? And questions of this form kind of unraveled the thread of optimism about legal formalism, I think. You have instead this view called legal realism, which says that legal reasoning rather, is extremely arbitrary at various points and depends on things so shocking as facts about what a judge ate for breakfast. So the right result of a case might depend on a ton of different things, which have nothing to do with logic and facts and whatnot. If a judge is angry, he might select one premise for use in legal reasoning. If he's in a good mood, he might select another premise for use in legal reasoning. And so I think that this whole enterprise of legal realism soured prevalent attitudes toward the potential of good what did they do? They soured prevalent cultural attitudes in the legal profession toward the success of legal formalism. Now, you'll recognize that Derrick Bell's piece for today is called Racial Realism. And you might be wondering, as I am, what exactly racial realism has with legal realism. Do racial realism and legal realism share any interesting properties? I don't think so. And I'm not really sure why there's so much energy expended at the beginning of Bell's article describing legal realism and the way in which the attitudes toward legal formalism were vitiated by the legal realists. I have just no idea about why this is at the beginning of the article whatsoever. But I do think there is a common pessimism or a common skepticism that legal realists and racial realists have. Of course, the legal realists are skeptical about the prospects of unbiased and perfect legal reasoning, if you will. And the racial realists, as we'll later find out at the end of the article, are skeptical of the idea that there will ever be racial equality in this country. But let's set that aside. I don't think legal realism and racial realism are connected in any especially interesting way. So you might worry that this whole foray into legal realism is really just a waste of everybody's time. I'm not sure about that. But at least we get some historical appreciation of a debate between the legal realists and the formalists. Now, another thing I would point out that is a little bit unsatisfying about Bell's article is that he never really argues for the idea that there will never be racial equality in this country. It seems like it would just be an argument that fails inductively. Suppose you have maybe 50 data points. How would you understand and extrapolate into the future to say that something could never be the case? It seems a little bit too quick. But the interesting thing is that his pessimism about the prospects for racial equality in America don't really seem to stem from any of the particular tenets of critical race theory. They seem like a conjecture, a prognostication, a prediction, if you will, more than they do a conclusion for which there's a robust and rigorous argument that's offered. It's just supposed to sort of grip you You're supposed to think that based on the prominence of a failure of Black people to maintain and achieve equality in America, that there will never be such. And perhaps the possibility of a failure to achieve this equality is a reason for instead harassing the white folk, as he concludes in his article. I think that's really all you're supposed to think after reading this. So the focus of this lecture really can't be on appraising the success of his argument for racial realism. What I'd like to focus on instead is really something more different than that, because I think there are some unique insights that he gives us about appreciating the quality of legal reasoning. When you look at Philip Bobbitt's 6 modalities of legal reasoning, as we did earlier in the semester, there are things like legal reasoning will be good when it's interpretive if it gets at the author's intention or explicates a common understanding that people may have had at the time at which the law was promulgated. A bit of interpretation might be good if it says something about the structure of government, meaning it says something about the intended purposes for which institutions of government were first created. It might be good if it weighs, the cost of implementing a certain rule. It might be good if it comports with pre-established precedent. All these things tend to be things that make legal reasoning good or bad. And those are our conventions, I think, the ones that are at least settled by the Supreme Court as making legal reasoning good or bad. Now, what I see Derrick Bell as doing, which really is the important contribution of this article, is giving us sort of criteria for evaluating legal reasoning is good or bad. And I see Derrick Bell as saying that legal reasoning might be adjudged to be good in a way that goes beyond perhaps those 6 modalities that Philip Bobbitt identified for us. So how does he do this? Well, I think the test case is Bakke versus Regents of California. Now, I'll be talking about this case in more detail next week, but it's important to realize for now just a few facts about this case. I'm 30, and you know what? So was this guy, Bakke. He was commonly thought to be too old for medical school. He's 30, he's washed up, he's past his prime. Not much hope for him at this point. By the time he graduates medical school and completes his residency, he'll be 38, which is really too old to do anything meaningful in life, right? I say that just a bit sarcastically, but this was the attitude in the 70s. If you were 30, you were just too old for medical school. Now, Bakke applied to medical school everywhere, and his MCAT was okay, and his GPA was okay. Really, he was just too old. He was 30. In any case, you can see where this is going. He was rejected from virtually everywhere. And ultimately, he got the decision from UC Davis. He was rejected from UC Davis. And what he found out about UC Davis is that basically what the University of California at UC Davis had done is they'd taken a demographic sketch of the population. I can't remember whether it was of the United States or just the surrounding region in Northern California, but they'd basically learned that there were a certain percentage of white people, a certain percentage of Hispanic people, a certain percentage of Black people, and a certain percentage of Asian people, and so on for any kind of racial class recognized by the government. And so they derived various percentages of which the population was constituted. And what they did in their admission process was, if there were, say, 60% white people in the relevant geographical area, then 60% of the incoming class would be white. And if there were 20% Black people making up the surrounding population, then 20% of the incoming class would be Black. Now, when Bakke compared his MCAT score and his GPA to that of the, say, 20% Black applicant, he noted that his GPA and MCAT score were far above, well above, let's say, the median and mean of those Black applicants. And so, feeling this was unfair, he sued the University of California, and he was ultimately admitted. Now, this decision in which the U.S. Supreme Court sided with Bakke against the University of California did not sit very well with Derrick Bell, and he criticizes this opinion on several grounds. And I think that when we consider what these grounds were, we learn something about what it is to do good legal reasoning from the perspective of critical race theory. So I'll draw your attention to this part of the text. One thing that the court has done badly in this case that we haven't read, but for our purposes, they relied heavily on the formalistic language of the 14th Amendment. So that's a bad-making feature of the court's reasoning here. Lots of things have good-making features and bad-making features, right? Every time you buy something on Amazon, you're looking at the reviews, trying to figure out what the pros and cons of a particular product are. I did this recently with a toaster oven. I'm reading the reviews, trying to figure out what its good-making features are. Why should I buy it? Is it reliable? Does it have extra features? Can it dehydrate food? Does it roast a chicken? Things of that sort. Those are the good-making features. And meanwhile, I'm the whole time keeping my eyes out for things that might be bad-making features of the toaster oven, right? Does it burn out after a year? Is it good value for money? Are there other products that seem to do the same thing for cheaper? Is there good customer support? Can I get my money back? All these things are say, reasons for doubting whether a product is good, so that you have your good-making and bad-making features for ordinary artifacts that we introduce into the world as humans. But it seems like legal reasoning, being also the sort of thing that's made by humans, can also have good-making or bad-making features, and we can evaluate those things. What Bell is saying here is that when one relies on formalistic language, it's a bad-making feature. And then likewise, utterly ignoring social questions about which race in fact has power and advantages, and which race has been denied entry for centuries into academia. And so with respect to these questions about affirmative action, it looks like another good-making feature would be if the court did consult questions about which race has enjoyed ascendancy, especially with respect to academic admission. A bad-making feature, in contrast, is when a court would ignore these kinds of questions. Here are some more bad-making features that the court has done in the Bakke versus Regents of California case. They've ignored historical patterns, they've ignored contemporary statistics, and they've ignored flexible reasoning. Now, of course, if you were to introduce a good-making feature analog of each of these bad-making features, you would say it would be good for a court to appreciate flexible reasoning, or to consult contemporary statistics, or to consider historical patterns, right? Okay. Now, following a realist approach, Bell continues, the court would have observed the social landscape and noticed the skewed representation of minority medical students. It would have reflected on the possible reasons for these demographics, including inadequate public school systems, a lack of minority professionals to serve as role models, and the use of standardized tests evaluated by white standards. Taking these factors into consideration, the court very well may have decided Bakke differently. So I think when we look at a simple argument like this, we're asking ourselves, where did these premises come from? Some of the premises that the Supreme Court introduced in the Bakke decision were formulaic, which is, in other words, I guess a way of saying that they were involved with slogans like colorblindness and racial equality and things of that sort, but they never included facts about which race has been denied entry for centuries into higher education. And so you might think of Bell as saying, when you think about where these premises come from, why can't it be good legal reasoning for you to include such facts in legal reasoning? I mean, you might have the text of the law. That might be a proper thing to put into your legal reasoning. That might be a good premise. Why can't the premises that give you legal conclusions include things like disparities and and include historical statistics and things of that kind. So it's really a skeptical challenge to the idea that legal reasoning, as it's been conducted, is really all that good. Why can't, says Bell, good legal reasoning include all of these things that he's just told us? Why can't it include contemporary statistics? Why can't it include facts about historical injustice, right? So on this slide, I've kind of put it out for you in black and white, right? What makes an argument good according to Derrick Bell? Well, consultation of historical injustices. That can make it good. It's not saying that legal reasoning must always do this. It's just saying that what it is to be good legal reasoning can include consultation of historical injustice, right? It's saying that good legal reasoning can appeal to contemporary statistics. It's saying that good legal reasoning can use flexible reasoning as opposed to formulaic reasoning, right? And it can consider questions about which races have been historically subordinate. Correspondingly, you can tell what Bell would dislike merely by negating 1 through 4. So legal reasoning might be bad, not necessarily if it's unrelated to race, but it might be bad if it ignores, in some context, historical injustice. It might be bad if it ignores contemporary statistics. It might be bad if it uses formulaic reasoning, though not necessarily, just in those cases where it matters, right, racially. And it might be bad, legal reasoning might be bad, when we ignore questions about which races have been historically subordinate. So then I think when we look at Derrick Bell's treatment of Bakke versus Regents of California, I really take that to be one of the most significant contributions from this piece that you read, hopefully, for today. It gives us some tools to think about whether legal reasoning is good or bad in the eyes of Derrick Bell. Now, there are, of course, other things that Derrick Bell analyzes in his article, many of which might be a little bit more controversial than that. One of the things that Derrick Bell really did not like was the appointment of Clarence Thomas. Now, I couldn't find too much of an argument in this piece for why this was ultimately a bad thing. There is a treatment of Clarence Thomas's appointment as though it were kind of like the appointment of a black overseer in a plantation. This was Bell's explicit metaphor that he used, right? Clarence Thomas, much like you would have the black overseer overseeing other slaves, and a plantation has been appointed to sort of oversee black people in America who are, according to Bell, kept in a state of subservience and don't have much prospect for extricating themselves from that position. But in reading this piece, I couldn't help but wonder what the argument for this would be. I mean, it's clear that Clarence Thomas is a conservative. It's clear that he replaced Justice Thurgood Marshall. It's clear that there was a long, protracted appointment proceeding in which it was alleged by Anita Hill that Clarence Thomas committed various acts of sexual misconduct against her and in the workplace. And it was, in many ways, the initiation of a long, drawn-out process, I think, in America to eradicate sexual harassment from the workplace. And I think Bell does have a good point when he mentions that it is kind of regrettable that, again, it looks like two black professionals are living out this lesson for the rest of America to learn about the impropriety of sexual misconduct in the workplace, right? All the shame and embarrassment and humiliation associated with that proceeding help other people, white Americans included, and especially white Americans, I guess, because of their prevalence, to live better lives. And this is only possible because of this public spectacle, really. That point is well taken. What else we find in the article is really just an insistence that Clarence Thomas was appointed in a way that subserves white supremacy. And this is perhaps one of the more controversial aspects of what Bell has said here. Now, is Bell correct to say that Clarence Thomas is this pawn of the white supremacists? Well, you might think so, or you might deny this. I guess I find it a little bit controversial myself. What's more interesting to me, though, as a instructor in logic and legal reasoning, is to think about the relationship between the tenets of critical race theory and what Bell has said. Here's a question I'd like to propose to you. Are any of Bell's statements about Clarence Thomas entailed by any of the tenets of critical race theory? So far in this class, we have been thinking about relationships of entailment. We're thinking about a relationship between a premise and a conclusion in which the premise makes it impossible that the conclusion is false if it's true. There are lots of different ways of saying that, but when the premises entail a conclusion, they guarantee in some way that the premise will be true. They guarantee it. Do any of the tenets of critical race theory about the ordinariness of racism, about the difficulty of eradicating racism, about the mind independence of racial categories, about the disparate needs of society affecting prevalent racial attitudes toward minorities, about the better epistemic standing of minorities to report on the prevalence of racism. Do any of those tenets entail anything Bell has said about Clarence Thomas? Well, arguably not. All the tenets of critical race theory could be true, and yet it might be false that Clarence Thomas is in fact this pawn of white supremacy. I think that's an important thing to appreciate. It shows us, I think, a distinction between what is essential to critical race theory, and it illustrates what those who are critical race theorists might say in the name of critical race theory. I guess Bell never explicitly says that to be a critical race theorist, you have to accept that Clarence Thomas is a pawn of white supremacy. But make that distinction. Think about the difference between the tenets of critical race theory and something that might be fairly controversial. That's said by a critical race theorist. I think when you appreciate that difference, you'll be well along the way in appreciating subtle distinctions that are important to good legal reasoning. I'd like to kind of conclude this lecture by thinking about other possible relationships between propositions, such as the tenets of critical race theory. You might not think that any of the tenets of critical race theory entail Bell's conclusion about Clarence Thomas. But entailment isn't the only game in town, is what I want to say. Entailment is a particularly strong relationship in which the truth of a conclusion is guaranteed, but there might also be propositions that stand in other relationships to conclusions. One of the relationships you might think about is one of evidential support, in which the truth of one fact makes it more likely that another fact will occur or be true or something like that. For instance, it's quite rainy today, but I mean, if I look outside, it's merely cloudy and there's no current rain. You might think, though, that the presence of these clouds in the sky raises the probability in some way of there being rain later. And so the fact that there are clouds in the sky doesn't entail that it will rain. After all, it might be cloudy without any rain, right? We've all seen days like that. But a lot of times rain does follow these clouds. And so the presence of these clouds is a good reason for thinking that there might be rain later. In other words, the clouds in the sky raise the probability of there being rain later. And then you can wonder whether any of the tenets of critical race theory raise the probability that the appointment of Clarence Thomas is kind of like a white overseer appointing a black overseer in a plantation. I'm not sure exactly what the story would be there, but you might think, whatever you think about the plausibility of Bell's treatment of Clarence Thomas, you might think that this option, would be more attractive than saying that any of the tenets of critical race theory directly entail the conclusion that Clarence Thomas is merely a pawn of white supremacy, right? Maybe it's a more attractive option. A third option really is that a fact might be needed to explain something else. So when we think about scientific explanations, for instance, sometimes it's held that one fact will explain another, and it's needed to explain different things we see. I'm thinking here of evolutionary theory in particular. Some people look around the world and they notice the speciation that occurs in various regions, and so they think that something like an evolutionary theory is needed to explain the things we see. You might also wonder whether the tenets of critical race theory are like that. Maybe they help explain various things we see, including the appointment of Clarence Thomas. I'm not here to sort it all out for you. I'm going to have you do it on the final exam, where I'll basically give you a piece of legal reasoning. I'll ask you to evaluate it as though you were Derrick Bell. And then I'll ask you to sort of analyze whether any of the tenets of critical race theory I just said at the beginning of the lecture would entail those conclusions that you would have attributed to Bell. My suspicion is it'll be kind of a rare occurrence for any of the tenets of critical race theory to explicitly entail what Bell might say about a particular issue. But you might think about these alternative relationships. Might there be a relationship in which something is implied evidentially by one of the tenets of critical race theory? In other words, might it be the case that a tenet of critical race theory makes it more likely that something is occurring? You might think in contrast about whether a tenet of critical race theory is needed to explain another fact. So I think, in my eyes, these are the main insights to take away from Derrick Bell's piece. There is a little bit of confusion at the beginning about legal realism. It's never clear to me how exactly to think about legal realism and its relationship to racial realism. Racial realism, again, was this idea that Black people will never achieve full citizenship or full equality in the US. And there's never an argument offered for this. It's a conjecture, I think, that's supposed to grip us and kind of spar us to further movement. So don't think about counter arguments to racial realism. I think that wouldn't be a good use of your time, because there are no arguments, I think, given for that conclusion. And if there are, it would have to be inductive, and you might worry about an inductive argument of that kind for the normal reasons. But what I would like for you to focus on is this idea that facts about historical injustices are the kinds of things that can be premises that we appeal to in our legal reasoning. Why can't we appeal to these facts? That seems to me to be Bell's major contribution, and I think that idea is worth thinking about as we move toward thinking about affirmative action next week. So thanks for your time and attention. That's all I have to say about Derrick Bell. He'll come up again as we study for the final exam, but that's all for now.